A standard feature in the living room is a chimney, but what that creates is a couple of alcoves around the side of the chimney breast. And those could be a little bit of a tricky thing to deal with, because if you don't put anything there, it looks kind of empty. On the other hand, if you want to put a piece of furniture there, you're limited to the space, so finding one that fits exactly the space is almost impossible. And that in a nutshell explains why so many people have alcove units built in. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Reinventing Your Home. My name is Ross, and over the next 12 minutes we're making a pair of alcove units and a couple of floating shelves above them. So this is just a standard in-frame shaker style cabinet, and normally on a project like that I would make the carcasses first. However, in this instance, because the units need to be flush with the chimney, it's more beneficial if we make the frames and the doors first. So we have to be very precise when it comes to building the frame, and the thing we have to do here is we have to make it a couple of millimeters bigger than we need it, so that will allow us to scribe it, but not too much, so we won't damage the profile, because I wanted to have a 40mm frame that runs around the perimeter of the cabinets. And then here it's just a standard procedure of milling the timber in preparation for cutting it to size. This is pretty much done, so here we're cutting the stiles and the rails for the doors and the pieces for the face frames. And this is actually all the timber milled for this project. As you can see, on one end we have the stiles and rails, and the thinner pieces are the ones for the frames. And as I told you earlier, we're starting with the frame here. So the first thing here is we need to square one edge, and then we can cut it to size. We got to do that several more times, which I won't bore you to death, but essentially once we have the measurements, we just have to cut all of the pieces, and then after that we can jump to assembling the face frame. Now there are many different ways you can put your face frame together. You can mortise and tenon it, you can do some you can use dominoes or dowels. However, in my opinion, the most efficient way you can do that is by using pocket holes, because none of those pocket holes will be seen. We can butt them against the cabinet, it's all going to be hidden, and it takes a couple of minutes to build the frame. I put a little bit of glue, which some may say it's unnecessary. However, I like to do it, even if it's a placebo effect. What I like to do here when it comes to driving the pocket screws in is I like to put the frame on the clamps, because sometimes when you're driving the screws in through the pocket holes, they can have a tendency of pushing the pieces apart and leaving a gap in the joint. However, if you have a clamp that's big enough and you can clamp it together, you can put the pressure on the joint and you can drive your screws, and that thing is not going to go anywhere, leaving you with an absolutely perfect joint. Once we do that, we can measure up for the doors and we can start building the doors. So the first thing here, as we have the stiles and rails cut, I would go over and I would cut my groove with the router. I've got this 1/2" grooving bit, which I normally use in cabinet doors. Once the groove has been cut on all of our pieces, we can then jump on the miter saw and cut our stiles and rails to size. Starting from one end, we need to square the piece, and then that will allow us to take measurement and then cut it to the desired length. Once this is done to all of the door components, we can then jump onto the secondary table saw and cut our stub tenons. So this is my preferred method of cutting those stub tenons. As you can see here, I do several passes. I've got the fence set up at 1/2 inch. What I like to do is I like to leave my tenon slightly oversized coming off the saw. You could potentially fine tune the saw. However, I think it's unnecessary. I like to leave it a little bit fat. Then I will do several passes with the router plane to hand fit the joint. That way I can make sure I have a nice and snug joint. And then the next step here is we need to glue up the door and put it on the clamps. So this is a standard shaker style door. And like with any panel doors for that matter, we're only gluing up the joints. We do not put glue where the panel is. And of course, like any other rule, this has an exception too. So if I was to make the door entirely out of MDF, I would glue the panel. You can see in some of my previous videos where I'm making the entire panel door out of MDF, I glue the panels. So this rule usually applies to working with solid woods, because solid woods have a lot of movement, so you don't want to restrict that. When you're working with material as stable as MDF, you can't afford to glue the panel, because that thing is not going anywhere. But technically any material moves, but the movement in MDF is negligible, so you could glue up the panel on a panel door made out of MDF. Anyways, back to the build. So this is our door pretty much ready. As you can see, we are applying a little bit of pressure on the clamps and we have some glue squeeze out, which is a great thing because it's indicative of a very tight joint. And this is our second door done. So we need to make a couple more and then we need to leave them on the clamps for 24 hours. In the meantime, we can start working on the carcasses by going to the table saw and cutting some strips of plywood, the size of which is the depth of our cabinets. As you can see here, our cabinets are not going to be very deep, but this is how the customer wanted them, so this is how we make them. However, it was very good for me because they were barely fitting on my miter saw, because had they been half an inch wider, I wouldn't have been able to do those cross cuts on the miter saw, which is not a problem. I could have done it in a different way, but it was easy on the miter saw. Before we get to assemble the carcasses, I wanted to prep my shelves. So these are the internal shelves that go inside the cabinets. So what I'm doing here is I'm just gluing a strip of redwood so the plies won't be seen once you open the doors. I would hold it with a little bit of masking tape. It doesn't need a lot of pressure, you can put it on the clamps, but that does just fine. And I'll leave that for several hours. In the meantime, I can start working on assembling the carcasses. So the first thing here is we need to drill those pocket holes on the outside of the cabinets, which we use to attach our face frame. And then we apply a couple of coats of walnut stain to the inside of the cabinets. This is one of my favorite methods of finishing plywood. However, the downside of which is that you have to apply the stain once the cabinet's in pieces, because if you don't, you're never going to be able to get an even finish. And then the next step would be to drill our pinholes for our adjustable shelves. We do that with a jig. I've made this one a while back and I keep it in my workshop because it's quite handy, as you can see here. And this is our cabinet and what it looks like before assembly. I took this video because I think it really shows how beautiful the grain is, and that walnut stain really enhances the grain. I'm a big fan of that, even though it's a bit of a darker finish. Some people don't like those darker colors on the inside of the cabinet. I like it personally. The customer was happy with that, which is the most important thing in this case, because unlike me, they have to live with that cabinet. So if they don't like the dark colors, I'm going to change it. Anyways, they were happy with it, and the next step here is we need to start working on those shelves. So the shelves are made out of beech, and that is in order to match the mantelpiece on the fireplace. First thing we need to do here is we need to joint a couple of boards of beech. I'm using some biscuits. That's just for alignment, because after that it's a lot less planing. I'd like to keep those shelves as thick as possible. So this is, if I remember correctly, I think this is a 40mm or maybe 38, but it's in that region, thick beech. So I had it machined, and then the next step is putting some biscuits, put it on the glue on the clamps, and then leave it for 24 hours before we get back the next day to finish it. In the meantime, however, we get to install our face frames and hang our doors. As you can see here, I've had my face frames primed prior to installation, and that is for a reason. A couple of reasons actually. One being that I wanted to prime the back, which if you install it first, you're never going to be able to get there. And then the second one is that I just didn't feel like cutting in around that plywood and risking the possibility of getting any white primer on it. Then, using the pocket holes that we drilled earlier, we get to attach the face frame. Because none of those are going to be seen, this is a really good alternative to having any visible fixings on the front. Now when it comes to installing the doors, I've decided to spare you this in that video because I've done plenty of other videos. Actually, I'll link the one that's specifically on hanging doors. Instead, I wanted to show you this little trick, which is just clamping an offcut to the back of the door once you're drilling the hole for the knob. That way you prevent any tear out on the back. Simple things like that overall add up to a better result. Then the next day we get back to working on the shelves. So the first thing we do after we take them off the clamps is we do several passes on the thicknesser, just so you can plane it to size. And then what I wanted to do here is I'm using this piece of sapele. Really doesn't matter what kind of wood it is, I just had an offcut of sapele, and I'm machining it to 12mm square, because I would use that for the brackets. You will see that in a second how I'm thinking of attaching the shelves. You get a bit more clarity on that in a minute, but at the moment I'm just running it several times through a thicknesser just so I can get it square at 12mm. And then here I wanted to pre-drill my holes because these little battens I'm planning of attaching to the wall and then using them to slide my shelves in. So what I'm doing here is just running some pilot holes with a countersink, and then I needed 4 pieces. Once those are done, we can create the groove in which those would sit. Before we do that, however, we had to trim the shelf to size. This is a standard procedure here. We square one edge, and then we take a measurement and then cut the shelf to size. I would spare you most of it, but it had to be done. And then we get to the tricky bit here, which is cutting that groove for our brackets. Now, because this is against the grain and the groove needed to be about 20 millimeters deep, which could be quite sketchy if you're trying to do that in one pass, which is something I definitely wouldn't advise you. What I was doing instead here is I was doing several shallower passes, eventually getting down to 20 millimeters, and surprisingly it went really well. I was expecting more vibration, and I was worried that it might be a bit of a sketchy cut, but it worked really well. Just I wouldn't push it in one pass. I did 5 or 6 before I got down to 20 millimeter. Then the last thing here is just adding some chamfer to the front edge. I just think it finishes the piece nicely. And with that done, we're pretty much done in the workshop. So next thing is we need to load up and go on site. Now on site I don't film everything because I usually have to ask permission, but I filmed the end product. So this is what the finished cabinets look with the shelves. The shelves are matching the height of the mantelpiece by request of the customer, and our cabinets are finished in white eggshell. I would appreciate if you take the time to drop me a comment to let me know what you think of this project. As always, thank you for watching to the end, and I will see you on the next one.